spokesperson on environment protection, for social security and employment, a member of Labour's National Executive Committee from 88 to 97, and chair of the NEC Women's Committee from 93 to 96. She quite famously in 2003 resigned from the government over the Iraq War, and in 2006 she resigned the Labour whip. She stood down from Parliament in 2010 and is now active in various organisations working on slum upgrading in the developing world, transparency in oil, gas and mining, African-led humanitarian action, destitute asylum seekers in Birmingham, trade justice for the developing world, and for a just settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. She is a trustee of Hope Projects West Midlands, Trade Out of Poverty, the Welfare Association of Africa Humanitarian Action, and she is a patron of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions UK. She is a member of the Advisory Committee of International Lawyers for Africa, and in March 2011 she was elected chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So quite a pedigree here, quite a wealth of knowledge that feeds into her thinking about issues of international development and global poverty. And we're delighted that Clare Short has now arrived, and seamlessly, therefore, I'm going to welcome her to this JustShare lecture, and to welcome you again to All Hallows. So my name is Coach Olivier Vicker here. I'm also the chairman of JustShare Steering Committee. And JustShare, for those who don't know, it is a coalition of churches and other development agencies seeking to engage with the City of London and beyond by advocating on issues of global and economic injustice. JustShare holds regular debates, such as this one, training seminars and other events to promote justice for the poorest in the world, and a just share of the world's resources for all. We're delighted at the interest in today's lecture, and I would particularly like to welcome the group of students from the Ladywood Bible School in Sweden. Do you want to raise your hands where you are? So they discovered we had this lecture, so we have a group from Sweden who want to hear all about your experience there. And also the group of A-level and IB students from St. Dunstan's College in Catford. Do you want to raise your hands? It's a bit like University Challenge. And you'll all have time to ask your questions. It's good to see you all here this evening, and now I hand over to Clare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry you were subjected to such a long bio. I went to the wrong church, so I went to St. Mary. Right, so I'm very pleased to be here with you. It's important that we discuss and think about these issues carefully. The world's getting itself into trouble, and I think foolish mistakes are being made, and we need people of moral conscience and reflection to start to raise their voices and demand a shift. The question before us is, does aid work, or is aid effective? And the very short answer is yes. The global effort to promote development and reduce poverty has had considerable success, measurably, over the last 15 years. In the year 2000, as you probably know, to mark the new millennium, global leaders attended a UN meeting that was attended by more presidents and prime ministers than ever previously, and agreed to mark the new millennium by working together to systematically reduce poverty. And they set targets to measure progress. So this is the first time ever in the history of the world that the global leadership of the world came together and set out the objective of systematically reducing poverty for everybody, rather than doing a bit of good here and there, which, you know, is fair enough. But this is a bigger ambition. It was a very important moment in history, I think. It coincided with a historical opportunity. Sorry. My voice is going a bit. That we're now losing the end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid in Africa that had caused all sorts of conflicts and civil wars in Africa, with the release of Nelson Mandela, and before the attack on the Twin Towers and the in my view, mistaken response to that, the launching of the global war on terror. You had the international community saying, what should we do? You know, we'd lived since the Second World War with the Cold War and then get lots of nukes and decide which side you're on, and so a balance of terror that happily didn't lead to a conflagration, though came close, the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. And there we have the new millennium in the sense that the world had to think about the year 2000, what we're going to do in the future. And the grasp was for this absolute priority of the systematic reduction of poverty. And that led to the Millennium Development Goals. And they were objectives to be met by 2015. And of course we're in that year now, as you know. And considerable progress has been made, and I'll come on to that. But the targets weren't sort of plucked from the air, halving the proportion of people in extreme poverty in the world and so on. They were taken from progress in development, lessons that had been learned about what worked, big global UN conferences that had been on education, women in Beijing, reproductive health care in Cairo. There had been a whole series of conferences and a distillation of the experience of the world in promoting development, and then this was all done together and pushed to a higher level of objective. If everyone's concentrated, maybe we could achieve more. The results are not perfect and much remains to be done, but they're very considerable. The first was to reduce the proportion of people living in extreme poverty by 2015, because of course this is a moving target. Population was rising at the same time as these targets were to be met. And in 1990, which was the base date, almost half the population in developing regions lived on less than $1.25 a day, say 80p. And this has now dropped to 22% by 2010. And the numbers involved were 700 million, and that is going to be met this year. There's been a massive advance in the fight against malaria and TB. 3.3 million people who otherwise would have died of malaria, mostly children in Africa, are alive and thriving because of the efforts that were put into that. Access to improved drinking water reached 2.3 million people and met the target of halving the proportion of people without access to improved drinking water, getting all children into primary school, including girls, which is actually the single most powerful thing you can do to promote development in any country. If a generation of children go to school, including the girls, even only at primary level, they lift their country. Girls who've been to school, marry later, have less children, who are more likely to survive, they're better at increasing family income, accessing healthcare, getting their own children to school, and so on. The level of development assistance went up. We need to do much more on the environment, as you know, but the phasing out of ozone-depleting substances was achieved with international agreement. Hunger continued to decline, but there is still too much of it. Child mortality declined, and so on. So, just because there's a big fashion now turning against development, saying aid doesn't work, and the facts are there, and they're overwhelmingly clear, and it just isn't true. And in fact, we've achieved much more in the last 15 years than ever before in human history in terms of more human beings having the chance of a better life. But of course, the job is not complete. The target was only to half the proportion. That isn't adequate. But it shows what can be done with international cooperation. And now, of course, there's a big international debate going on about what are the new targets post-2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be set towards the end of this year. And the proposed target is, of course, to eliminate extreme poverty in the world. Which won't mean that there won't be some poor people, but make people that are abjectly hungry, children that are malnourished and stunted. We're looking towards that being eliminated from human history. Not a small thing, though we need to keep concentrating if we're to achieve it. But it's wrong, pure maths, and it's important to remember that and to be proud of that, but it'd be wrong to conclude that because aid works, we've proved that we care about the poor, we're making progress, and all is well. We have to reflect why do we care about aid? Why is it important? Now, clearly, it's morally important. If every single human being in the world is of equal value, then it is disgusting and wrong that some of us live with plenty and others don't have enough nourishment for their children. A lot of children who survive don't get enough to eat, and their little bodies and brains are stunted for the rest of their life when we have problems of obesity and so on. You all understand the moral point. But coming behind the moral point is a point about how to make the world safe and sustainable for everybody. And a world of bitter inequality and hunger and poverty is going to be full of anger and danger and people who dislike other people and the risks of conflict and so on and so forth. So a more just and fair world where everyone has a fair chance is also a safer world for everybody, and perhaps the best security policy that we could have. So it seems to me there's almost a trap here. Caring people focus on aid and development and lobby about it and ask their governments to make sure that they spend enough money and focus on the poor. And then they leave foreign and defence policy to others who focus on military spending and who's the enemy. So, for example, in the growth of aid spending in recent years, massive figures were spent in Afghanistan and Iraq, not to great effect, and behind a mistaken and ill-judged and not honest foreign and defence policy initiative. So if you just say, oh, isn't it good we're spending more on aid, but actually we're spending a lot of it behind a disastrous mistake that was ridden with lies in Iraq, then we've got a contradiction here, and it isn't good enough that we just concentrate on one and ignore the effects of the other. I mean, similarly, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, the West Bank, Gaza and the East Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley in international law should be a Palestinian territory, but is occupied by Israel and has been for a very long time. And in international law, an occupying power is responsible for the humanitarian care of the people it occupies. But we, particularly the EU, spend a lot of money providing for the Palestinians in their oppression and difficulties. Now, doesn't that make the continuation of the occupation easier?
With respect, Ms. Short, no, it doesn't, because it is protect our territory.
I can't hear you, but if you wait till the end, you could, unless you think, oh, you're saying you can't hear? No, okay, well then we can talk about whatever you want to talk about at the end of the lecture, because there'll be time for talk. So, you see the point that I'm making, that you can't simply say aid is good, let's spend lots of aid on being kind to people, if you don't examine what is the foreign and defence policy that might be causing some of the suffering that causes the aid to be spent. The current spending on the military globally is $1.7 trillion. That's 1,000 billion, 1,000 million. It's the highest it's ever been in the world, and nearly half of it is US spending. Current spending on aid globally is $134 billion, considerably less. UK aid, interestingly, for those of you from the UK, is now at an all-time high of £11.3 billion. Our military spending is 40 billion. And yet we have, in the UK anyway, a pretty active campaign in Parliament, in lots of the press, saying we're spending too much on aid and we should be spending more on the military. I don't know if you've noticed. And yet those are the figures. And the argument is, I think, as I have laid it out. Now, President Eisenhower, when he was retiring as president, you know, he was a Republican president. He was a major general in the Second World War. But his retiring speech to the American people said, beware the military-industrial complex. beware the vested interest that there is in military spending in that massive industry. There's lots of vested interest that will call for more and more spending, and then of course if you've got lots and lots of military and military equipment, you have to use it sometimes to prove that it's necessary. Now, it is my serious submission to you that the attack on the Twin Towers was a dreadful crime, leading to the death of 3,000 and so people, and was vicious and cruel and deeply criminal. But the response to it, to increase military spending to a higher level than in the heights of the Cold War, when what we were after was an idea and a band of men holed up in a cave in Afghanistan, seems to me to be an extraordinary and foolish response. The declaration of the global war on terror, the need for massively more military spending, clearly with the crisis that it need to be faced, but a massive military effort was surely not the wisest. Similarly, if you look at the story of Afghanistan, it was US policy supported by the UK in cooperation with Saudi Arabia that encouraged and armed and funded an Islamic movement to resist the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan when, of course, the Soviet Union came right up to the borders of Afghanistan. And the Soviet occupation wasn't gentle, but the roots of Osama bin Laden and all of that was in Western policy in resisting what went on in Afghanistan. I've already mentioned Israel-Palestine, which I think maybe is what's annoying the man at the back. And you all know the story of Iraq. Yes, Saddam Hussein was a cruel dictator, but he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and they knew he didn't. And there are other cruel dictators like Saudi Arabia, but they're our best friend. The answer isn't to go around the world invading any government that we don't like, but the idea that we can have massive military force and then use it to get our way and to oppress other people is, I think, leading to more and more disorder, more and more violence, feeding the willingness of dispossessed and angry young Arabs and Muslim people to join up with vicious movements who, of course, follow a distorted version of Islam that comes out of the teachings in the mosques and madrasas of Saudi Arabia. So, the argument I want to put to you is that aid works spectacularly well and has worked fantastically well in the last 15 years, and we have to go on. The population of the world is growing, but we now have an international system that's capable of collaborating to lift the poorest of the world out of abject poverty. We should be proud of that, and we should go on with that. And I think we have a dominantly unjust and unwise foreign policy that can't be patched up by aid, and that if you want a world that is fair to people and gives them life chances that are fair and decent, and if we want a safe and secure world, then the values that underpin our belief in aid and development, a world of justice, a world that values each human being equally, you can't just do it with aid spending. You have to take those values into foreign policy, and you have to challenge some of the mistakes that are being made now. Otherwise, we're going to see more and more conflict, less and less belief in development, and more trouble for generations to come. I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to answer all and any of your questions.
But not many questions over the Twitter feed, but we will continue to ask questions on wide-ranging topics. If people who are sitting on this side would like to join the middle sometimes squeeze in, please do so.
Yes, we're going to have a gentleman from the back who so rudely interrupted.
Well, Ms. Short, first of all, I apologise for earlier interruption.
Can you speak nearer to
Hello, Ms. Short, can everyone hear me okay? Apologies for the earlier interruption. You spoke about Palestinian suffering. Can you tell me when the last time democratic elections were held in the Palestinian authorities and in Gaza? They are almost really dictatorships that almost brought the sufferings on their very own people.
Right, if you'd like to sit down and hand the microphone back, I will answer you. Yes, the last elections were in 2006. The last democratic elections supervised by all sorts of international observers who found them free and fair. By a small head, Hamas won those elections. And the West didn't accept that outcome and declared that Hamas was a terrorist organisation, which is, of course, what also happened in Algeria, which is one of the reasons why so many angry young Muslims think that they can't get justice through democracy. So that's the answer to your question, and the cutting off of Gaza and the siege of Gaza continues. And of course the International Court of Justice, which is the highest court that determines international law on behalf of the international community, in 2004 gave an advisory opinion saying the route of the wall that separates the expanded Israeli territories from the Palestinian occupied territories is illegal, the settlements are all illegal, and that Israel's behaviour in the occupied territories is a gross breach of international law. And we don't do anything. We continue to arm. The US continues to veto any resolution that goes to the Security Council that calls for the implementation of international law. The EU gives Israel privileged access to the European market, which is the largest single market in the world and is of great economic importance, in a trade treaty which is similar to trade treaties with others, which have preconditions about respect for human rights and international norms. It's a tragic situation. The suffering of the Palestinians is truly dreadful. I've been there over the years since 1985 or 6, and it gets ever worse and worse and worse. And of course, in the long term, it's a disaster for Israel, whereas holding Israel to international law and getting a settlement would be in everybody's interest. But on this, the West is completely hypocritical, and so is the EU.
So a lot of aid goes to African countries, which is quite common. But what is and obviously a lot of those who talk about democracy, I think in Nigeria recently it was the first time that an elected president actually came to power after Jonathan Goodluck. But what would you say, if it's not just about aid, and it could be things around trade, what would the sort of proposed solutions be when you've got, instead of just giving aid, you want to promote trade, you want to promote development, but when you've got such sort of corruption that stems from the top, from the powerful, what are the kind of answers or things that can be done to help end up promoting whatever aid, the gap that aid doesn't plug, what could be done there?
This is a very important question, because people often, if there's a coup or a cruel government takes over, people say aid should be withdrawn. But surely that's wrong. If some of the poorest and most oppressed people in the world are subject to a bad government, clearly one shouldn't give aid that helps the government in any way, but one should be looking to engage with the people of that country and relieve their suffering. Of course, when you've got a really cruel government that is unreformable, it's very difficult to do aid and development of the best kind, which is investing in the institutions of the state to enable it to be able to provide healthcare, education, good economic management for its people. But I think the crude call that comes out of our media, if ever there's a bad government, to cut off all aid, is really mistaken, and we should say no, engage, see what can be done. Because there again, if you take universal primary education, even in a dictatorship, if you can manage to, the international system can manage to ensure all children go to school, they're going to change their country as they grow. So there's ways of engaging that don't mean helping in any way a corrupt government. The other thing to say is there's more multi-party democracy across the since the end of the Cold War, including massively across Africa, than the Yemen has ever been in human history. And in the case of Nigeria, there have been elections since the military stepped down in the early 90s, but this is the first time there was a peaceful change to another party in a democratic election. But it isn't true that Nigeria didn't have some form of democracy before that. There's no doubt Nigeria has massive rich oil resources that are between multinational companies and the kleptocratic elite. The benefits don't flow properly to the people in a disgraceful way, and there's far too much poverty in that country given the riches that come from the oil resources. But you understand my answer. This is a very important question. The crude media, let's pull out every country that hasn't got a desirable government, means abandoning the poorest and most oppressed people of the world. It seems to me the interventions have to be cleverer to make sure that the government can't misuse them, but we shouldn't abandon those people.
Well, one of the biggest reductions in global poverty has been to do with the rise of China, and that hasn't had much world aid. So if economic and political change in countries, that would do more help reduce poverty than aid. I don't know if aid really make much of a difference. Whereas if it is political change within the country itself, like China and these places, they have really reduced
Yes, you're right. The very big numbers of reduction of poverty come out of China because of China's economic development. Actually, there was quite a lot of aid in China helping it get to the point of the economic reforms that's led to that take-up. A big chunk of UK aid goes through the World Bank and those international development banks. The World Bank was heavily engaged in helping China put the reform arrangements in place that led to its economic growth. So it isn't that China just went and did it all without changing any of its institutions and opening the country in ways that helped it to attract good investment and so on. But good development everywhere helps both to secure decency for human beings, education, healthcare and so on, but also help countries that often, poor countries, have very weak government capacity to build institutions that lead to better economic management, therefore more inward investment, better economic growth. And to get good development, you need investment in human beings, and just as in our country, in their abilities and their education, and also the institutions of a state to ensure that there's beneficial economic growth. And good development does that and focuses on both.
Hello, we're just about to come into an election, and without getting into particular party politics, UKIP, for example, as you know, have been saying that we must massively reduce our foreign aid. And the argument they give is that a lot of it is misused, and we're wasting the money and we could use it better at home. I personally don't agree with that, but curious to have an answer that you might want to share with us, because it's something we're all hearing too constantly. It's a soft target and it's quite upsetting.
Well, as I said in my remarks, this propaganda is out there. The right-wing press is running it, and UKIP is running it particularly hard, and it's not true. And we've had massive progress with good use of aid. It doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't the odd problem here and there. We're talking about a global system trying to operate in some of the most fragile countries in the world. It would be surprising if some errors weren't made or some money didn't go the wrong way. But there are very stringent systems for UK aid. Actually, I think now too many bureaucratic hurdles. If the UK system has got more money, less staff in the Department of International Development, and is focusing more on fragile states. And if you're working in, countries like Somalia and Yemen, and countries that are in great difficulty, to have vast bureaucratic proof that every single penny will be spent correctly, I think is training the system beyond endurance. But the truth is, development's been effective. The UK has been a respected leader. We've lost. In the international system, Britain has lost respect in foreign policy terms massively, and is now seen as just a sort of echo of mistaken US policy constantly, and people rather sneer at us in the way that they used to respect the UK as being a great respecter of international law in the post-colonial era. But on our development efforts, we're seen as a leading player and it's very effective, and we should be very proud of that. And UKIP's wrong about that, as it is about so many other things. I'm afraid UKIP is trying to respectabilise the old National Front and the EDL and the BNP and stir up that antagonism pot. And if you look into the background of most of their candidates, it's pretty disreputable. But happily, it seems to me they've peaked, and which is good to know. You can forward us in some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't forward all the people all the time.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much. My question is, what are the best levers to use against corrupt governments? And can you give any examples where these have been used successfully?
Corrupt government is a big phrase. I mean, you've got lots of different kinds of governments. In the poorest countries, often with very weak capacity in the government, but usually some reformers who want to take things forward, and some people who are misusing the system for their own benefit. So the remedy to take depends on where you are and who you're trying to work with. One of the examples that I'm most proud of that we, the UK, engaged in, so it's an example that's an answer to your question, when I was in government, was Rwanda after the genocide. Rwanda after the genocide, when 1 million people were slaughtered under orders in 3 months out of a population of 8 million, so imagine the scale of it if you think of how many that would be in the UK. And when the new government took over, every institution was broken, there was no glass in any of the offices of any ministries, all the papers had been burnt, there was nothing. And of course everyone was saying there won't be any economic growth, and we just have to give humanitarian aid to Rwanda, which is of course feeding the hungry, and you can do that, but that means the country will never recover. So we, the UK, stepped forward because Rwanda no longer trusted the Belgians or the French because of the bitter history of their engagement in those two countries that had been close to them. And we said, we will commit budgetary aid, that is, money into your budget on an absolute agreement about what it's to be spent on, and us having scrutiny of the systems and helping you build systems, so that the money you raise from your taxation also goes alongside the money we commit and other countries come in. And bit by bit, we help that country build quite robust institutions. It's criticised for being a very authoritarian country, but everyone agrees in all the international measures it's not in any way a corrupt country. So when you can do it, say if you want to invest in helping a country build an education system that can train its own teachers, provide its own books, maintain its own schools, and have a sustainable education system, if you can commit money into the education department budget in return for you having shared scrutiny so that you know that every penny is being properly spent, you also help the country build institutions that will go on working when your aid comes to an end. That's the ideal. But in some countries it's impossible to do it, and of course in times of crisis, in Yemen and so on, you have to just provide whatever humanitarian relief you can to people until such time as there can be a political solution, and then the country can be rebuilt.
Do you think that development aid could reduce the need for peacekeeping missions in unstable states?
Did everyone know the question? It's an interesting question. Could development aid reduce the need for peacekeeping missions? The largest peacekeeping operation in the world is in Eastern Congo, which is a very poor country, massively rich in natural resources, but has been misused because of those natural resources since King Leopold of the Belgians. People have gone there because they've got very valuable minerals and oil and all the rest of it. And the Eastern Congo is still unstable because of the war that was the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda. Now that peacekeeping operation, and they are paid for, by the way, the members of the Security Council vote for a UN peacekeeping operation, and then countries pay in proportion to their dues into the UN system, which are in proportion to your GDP. So Britain will be paying a fair whack. Now in the early stages, and this isn't directly relevant to your question, but the big powers vote for and pay for peacekeeping operations, and then they don't put any troops into them. The poorest countries in the world send their troops, and they have very weak logistics, to cover a vast territory like the Eastern Congo, no helicopters and so on. And it was a very ineffective peacekeeping operation. It's been strengthened recently and given a stronger mandate and seems to be making more progress. So in the case of the Congo, disastrous rule for years. I mean, there was an election after independence and the Americans didn't like who won it, Patrice Lumumba, and so organised a coup. This is the Cold War days, and he was thought to be too friendly towards the Russians and so on. And then there was a dictatorial kleptocrat, but he was given aid right up to the 90s because he was a pro-Western dictatorial kleptocrat, but he raided and destroyed the country. And then was overthrown. So in that case, it needs help with aid and it needs peacekeeping in parts of the region to stabilise the country. In Sierra Leone, which is closer to, there was a vicious civil war. Again, they have diamonds and other rich minerals, so that can often lead to conflict when they're mismanaged. And there was a UN peace process, a UN peacekeeping force that nearly failed, and the UK intervened in a very constructive way, stabilised the situation, then came in with aid to rebuild the country. So I think it's more like that. It depends what the starting point is, but a country that's recovering from conflict or recovering from civil war needs peacekeeping to stabilise it, but then needs development so it won't end up with such poverty that it slips back into conflict. And Sierra Leone, which is still very poor but has had changes of government by democratic elections, is an example of it working very well. And the Democratic Republic of Congo, I think, I was there just last week, is doing better. It's a vast country with enormous difficulties, but it's beginning to make progress and to manage its natural resources better. So there's hope there too.
Thank you. My name is Peter Moore. I recognise that many of the advances in development that you've described are threatened by the impact of climate change. What do you think the UK government's response should be? Should it be to alter DFID's programmes to take a greater account of climate change, or does it need some sort of separate initiative?
I think the answer is both. We're coming up to a conference in Paris shortly to see if we can get a new agreement on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and because both China and the US have now given some commitment, we might get a positive outcome from that meeting. And clearly, then you need a global agreement with the biggest emitters and the biggest historical emitters giving the biggest commitment, and aid to countries that are poor to not follow our dirty route to fossil fuels, but jump over that and go for renewable energy sources and so on. And that already exists, the Global Environmental Facility, and I've seen it at work for example, in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, there's a great big waste dump quite near the city, and they're trying to move it out. And there's a global environmental facility grant to take off the methane, and then it's going to be converted to a park, and they're building a waste-to-energy. So that's, which will fuel their new rail line in Addis Ababa. So that's kind of good win-win policy. But the global environmental facility contributions from the UK would come out of our aid money. And at the same time, DFID has put climate into the objectives of its development programme all over the world. So it is doing as you would expect. And of course, those who will suffer most from climate change are the poorest in the world. So there's no contradiction between attending to the need to both prepare for some of the unstoppable effects of climate change and try to prevent it getting more serious, by particularly helping countries to invest in renewables. And of course, if you get to Africa, the sun they have means, look at our solar panels, they've been massively more productive. And of course, Africa and South Asia are urbanising, and it's easier to provide modern facilities if populations cluster. But so we need a global arrangement, a global agreement, a global fund, which we've got, which should be renewed at the Paris meeting, and then all development programmes need to take account of the challenge and help countries to prepare to deal with them. And DFID is doing that.
My name is Peter West. I used to be involved in JustShare when I lived in London. I live in Bedfordshire now. A few years ago, a Zambian economist, you know this, wrote a book called Dead Aid. And insofar as I understand her arguments, one of them is that one of the things that aid has done is increase the dependence of so-called third world governments on the West and reduced their responsiveness to their own people. Do you think there's something in her argument? How would you otherwise answer her argument?
Of course, she's a big financier and says they should borrow from the capital markets, so she's got something of a vested interest. I think the answer is that aid can be badly deployed. I mean, like it's in this argument, is aid good or bad? Is public expenditure good or bad? Any money can be well or badly spent. In fact, we're living at a time when the global aid effort has been very effective measurably, but it doesn't mean it couldn't be better, and in some countries that it hasn't done as well as it should. Zambia's got particular problems with being very rich in copper and then going up and then suffering when the copper price drops, and it's in that kind of crisis now, and that leads to difficulties of stable economic management. But if countries were to continue to just give aid with no effectiveness and no graduation and no test of success, then there would be problems of dependency on outside sources, and then it's like the same problems that you get with mining and oil resources. If you get a lot of money from outside, currency goes up, other parts of the economy are squeezed. There are these problems that are Dutch disease, it's called, in the jargon. So there are those dangers, and they need to be carefully watched. But if you look at what's happened in the last 15 years, lots of low-income countries have graduated into lower middle-income countries, and lots of the countries that Britain had big aid contributions to are now on a much smaller amount. So I think her sweeping criticism is not true, and I think she comes from a partial opinion. I think there are some countries that have been aided for political reasons rather than developmental reasons, and then often the money is not well spent, like famously Mobutu's Zaire, where we were propping up one of the cruelest and most kleptocratic governments in the world, but the West was doing it because of the Cold War, and there were wars in Mozambique and Angola involving the Russians, so he was seen as a stabiliser. I mean, in the past we've had lots of that. There's no need for that anymore, although we've done some of it, I think, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think you have to take the critique seriously, and there is a danger if you just go on having very high levels of aid and external people telling a country what to do, because you don't get real reform until people want to take things forward for themselves. And if the outsiders are just dictating and governments are doing things to please the donors but don't really believe in the reforms, then it doesn't work. So there's an element of truth in her critique, but it's wildly exaggerated, and the record is not what she claims. I mean, the graduation of many countries that we've had big programs with, from low-income status and big aid programs to lower middle income and much smaller aid programs, points in the opposite direction.
Thank you. My question about development and climate change has already been answered to, but I'll hand over to my colleague who has another question.
Hi. question from a Swedish perspective. In Sweden, our government aid agency have been working from the mindset that if people are brought out of poverty, they will stop being religious, kind of the secularization theory. What role would you say do religious groups have in creating sustainable development?
Is that true of Sweden? Anyway, that's I mean, it's true that in our countries, as people become wealthy, they become more secular. And though we're going through a change now, I see there's the biggest number of Catholic women joining contemplative convents this year. So this growth in religious feeling and indeed the conflict that's going with it in the world, we're in a different phase of it. And that's a different discussion. But in the poorest countries of the world, people tend to be highly religious. And religious institution, of course, you get corrupt churches then as well as good churches, and you get sort of the new evangelicals where you pray to be rich and to pass your exams, and seems a little bit far from the Sermon on the Mount. But by and large, the religious institutions are very close to the people and are important players in being the civil society that represents the view of the people. There was a famous study in 2000, I mean it's a bit of a long time ago now, The Voices of the Poor, and it went to 60 countries, it was organised by the World Bank, and talked to poor people in all those countries and asked them who is closest to them, who do they look to for help and assistance or to express their views. And they said politicians are all rotten, which of course people would say in our countries too now. We don't see much of NGOs. We go to our mosques and our churches, they're the people who are there for us. So that's very important, both in terms of who gives immediate relief when there's a crisis, but also who is close to the people and can express their views and be taken into account properly when one is deciding on what kind of programs to bring into play. So, and certainly in my time in the Department for International Development, as well as trying to spend money well, we wanted to have a more informed debate in Britain about aid and development, rather than this crude one we've got in the press right now with the help of UKIP. And we did programs with all the great faiths of Britain, because you know all the religions of the world are represented here, about what good development looks like. And that isn't, I mean, in our history there are a lot of development agencies that come out of religious commitment. Christian Aid is from the Church of England, CAFAD is a Catholic one. Oxfam had some religious figures in it, but isn't religious, you know, in its ambience. So people of religious conviction have been a major part of the thrust, calling for a commitment to development. But then there's been lots of people of moral conscience who are secular, who also have contributed. And of course what we mustn't do is work only through churches. People must have the freedom to be of the faith they wish to be, but to have their prospects of development, whether they're religiously motivated or not. But by and large, I mean, the short answer to your question is that people of religious commitment have been one of the big forces saying we must work for development. And in the poorest countries, faith organisations are very powerful and have to be partners in the endeavour if we want to successfully work with the people.
My name is Suzanne Long. You haven't said anything much about the role of women. I know that DFID well supported UN Women when it was established, but also not terribly many women in most governments. I know there are, it's increasing. It's hard to see how women can influence government institutions when many of them, and most women are lower down the rank.
You're right, I mean I haven't said a lot about a lot of things because I'm wanting to fairly strong and then have this kind of discussion we've had. I did make clear that getting girls to school is profoundly developmental for a country, and there has been a big advance on that, and it improves the lives of those young women as they grow up, but it improves, they lift their country. Also, I mean, one of the Millennium Development Goals was to improve the status of women, and Kofi Annan famously once said, poverty has a woman's face. The poorest in the world are women and their children. And one of the targets is for increased women's participation in politics, and that has been going on across the world. The highest proportion of women in parliament anywhere in the world used to be famously the Scandinavian countries. They're still up there, but Rwanda is at the top, wanting to bring new people into politics so as not to repeat some of the disasters of its past. South Africa, when it had its first democratic elections in 1994, said 30% of parliamentarians will be women. So that kind of movement has been taking place across the world, bringing women into the public space. So there's more in education. Also, all over the world, domestic violence is an issue, and that's become a theme in development programs as well as in our home country. And then in any projects or recruitment exercises, there's much more attention to gender because the poor are predominantly female. It's not just doing the right thing, women should be there. It's if you want to lift the poor, women are the majority and they've got to be part of the change or you won't succeed. So there's been a big shift and some big advances, and you're right to raise it. And there's lots of feisty women out there feeling more empowered and contributing both at political level and local level and village level, which is very great to see and making a very important contribution.
One question.
You've spoken quite a bit about how war and conflict plays a role when it comes to poverty and such, but I wanted to know more about multinational companies, what their role is and how we can affect it, because when it comes to governments doing strange priorities where they put weapon more than aid, we can vote, we can have our say if we live in different countries, but when it comes to multinational companies, what can we do to affect them?
I think multinational companies have historically grossly misused and exploited poor countries, particularly around oil, mining, but more broadly. But there has been massive push to clean that up. For example, on corruption, up until the 1990s in this country, and in most European countries, bribes paid to a public official abroad were tax deductible. Isn't that shocking? And it was up to the 90s. Then we got the OECD Convention on Corruption, and it came out, this is a good thing that came out of America. They had such a scandal in the Nixon years that they brought in very strong anti-corruption legislation for all American companies. And then American companies felt they were disadvantaged across the world because other people could bribe and they couldn't, or they might be prosecuted. So we got the OECD, is a club of the wealthier countries that meets in Paris, a convention there, and all our countries had to bring into law legislation that made it as illegal to be corrupt in foreign countries as in your own. Britain had to have two goes. We brought very weak legislation that had to be told off by the OECD and bring in some more. So that has led to a big change. Multinationals, it's a criminal prosecution they will get, so they have to clean up their act and be much more careful. And then in things like mining and oil I've been working on for the last few years, and we just went to this massive new copper mine in Katanga in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the former Zaire. And the standards on the environment, on what happens to the waste and so on, are massively improved. There was an old guy there saying when he was a young man, how different it was, how they just throw any of the chemicals into the local lake and so on. And there's been a growth of improved standards, and there's a sort of investor standard. They won't invest with any mining company unless they meet standards of health and safety and environmental protection and so on. So I'm not saying everything's perfect, but I am saying there have been big advances, and that's through international campaigning by young people like you, demanding that standards are imposed and that this change comes about. I think the big thing that is now an issue but isn't properly solved is taxation and the whole issue of transfer pricing. I mean, everyone here knows about it because we've got Starbucks on every corner, and they don't pay any tax here because they're paying so much to Luxembourg for the intellectual property that it requires to set up a coffee shop in Britain. Transfer pricing, you know, that you pretend that you're having to pay something to another jurisdiction where taxes are very low. So you're beginning to get an OECD agreement that this has got to be cleaned up, and that the tax must be in proportion to the amount of economic activity in the country. And I think you could, if you were cynical, you'd say, well, it was only when it started hurting our kind of countries that we got the change. But the potential benefits of this to developing countries are very great. Take Zambia and all its copper. When you look at the height of the high price of copper and how little it got out of it, because companies, you know, they get tax relief in order to invest in the country, and then they have to pay for all the things that they're putting in. And I think it's the final segment that is still disgraceful. But we're at the beginning of getting significant change in that. There's a new organisation called Tax Inspectors Without Borders. People who've worked in taxation for years, using their skills to go to countries that might have weaker capacity, how to use these new rules in order to make sure that they enforce proper taxation. So, of course, there are smaller companies, there are bad companies. I'm not saying everything's perfect, but I am saying there has been a lot of change, and it's come out of people who've campaigned for change and demanded change, and lots of global agreements that are being enforced. So there has been progress.
I think we're going to have to leave it here for the open questions, but there's going to be an opportunity to stay behind for refreshments and continue the discussion with Clare over a drink. It's been a fascinating evening, and Clare, you've taken us through the four corners of the world, highlighting good and bad examples of aid and how it can make such a significant difference to people, the lives of those who are disempowered, but also showing how we can do more by the way of certainly the way in which we evaluate trade and how we implement it around the world, and how we ourselves behave, I guess, as citizens of the world. So thank you so much for such a fluent exposition of all that is happening, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.